Every so often, a machine appears that feels more like a statement than a product, something built not to satisfy a market, but to prove a point. You can sense it the moment you hear it, the way it revs with surgical precision, the way every surface seems carved from intent rather than convenience. It's the kind of creation that whispers rather than shouts, but the people who know, know. Beneath its fairings lies the DNA of racing dominance, the obsessive craftsmanship of engineers who refuse to compromise. Decades later, it still commands the kind of reverence normally reserved for pure prototypes. And yet somehow it was sold to the public, built by hand, licensed for the street, and engineered to destroy expectations of what a production engine could be. This is the story of what happens when racing ambition collides with road legality, when perfection is treated as a minimum standard. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which engineering legend you want to see next. The Honda RC30 was never meant to be ordinary, because nothing about its existence was. Conceived in the late 1980s as Honda's answer to the newly established World Superbike Championship, the RC30, officially known as the VFR 750R, was built for one purpose: to win races while technically qualifying as a street-legal motorcycle. But even that description sells it short. This wasn't a case of adapting a production bike for racing. It was the opposite. Honda started with a race machine, and then carefully engineered it to survive on public roads. To understand the RC30, you have to understand the culture that birthed it. In the 1980s, Honda's racing division, HRC, was on fire. From Grand Prix to endurance racing, the company's V4 engines were setting benchmarks. The VFR line already proved that a V4 could be smooth, tractable, and reliable, but the engineers at HRC wanted more. They wanted a homologation special that distilled their GP expertise into a form any privateer racer could buy. Every decision about the RC30, its engine, its chassis, its materials, was made with that target in mind. The heart of the Honda RC30 was its 748cc V4 engine, a configuration Honda was fiercely proud of. Unlike inline fours that dominated most sport bikes of the era, the V4 offered a unique balance of compactness, torque, and high revving ability. What set the RC30 apart wasn't just its layout, but the way Honda built it. This engine used titanium connecting rods, an almost unheard of feature in a production motorcycle at the time. These rods were light, strong, and expensive, each one carefully machined to racing tolerances. The pistons were forged, the crankshaft was balanced by hand, and the heads were ported by technicians who had built engines for the track. At the top, gear-driven camshafts gave the RC30 its trademark mechanical whine. But their real advantage was precision. No chains to stretch, no timing drift, just perfect synchronization up to the bike's stratospheric redline. But engineering excellence alone doesn't tell the whole story. Honda had to build this masterpiece under the constraints of road legality. The RC30 needed to idle smoothly, pass noise and emissions regulations, and deliver a usable power band for normal riding. Achieving that balance required countless iterations. Honda's engineers altered valve timing, reworked the fueling, and added flywheel mass, all compromises in the eyes of a racer, but essential to make the RC30 livable for civilians. Even then, it was hardly a practical motorcycle. It was expensive, roughly twice the cost of a typical 750 sport bike, and demanded the same kind of care you'd give a race machine. The frame followed the same uncompromising philosophy. Instead of a simple tubular design, the RC30 used a hand-welded aluminum twin-spar chassis, designed to be rigid yet forgiving under racing loads. The single-sided swing arm, originally developed for endurance racing pit stops, became a visual signature. Lightweight wheels, adjustable suspension, and brakes designed for repeated high-speed deceleration rounded out the package. Everything about the RC30's chassis spoke to intent. It wasn't built to look fast, it was built to perform fast. The ergonomics were aggressive, the seat high, the clip-ons low, and the mirrors nearly ornamental. On a racetrack, it felt alive. On the street, it felt like a caged animal waiting for its release. Yet this was exactly what made the RC30 legendary. It didn't pretend to be accessible. It invited riders to rise to its level. For those who understood it, the RC30 offered a kind of mechanical purity that modern electronics can't replicate. There was no traction control, no ABS, no digital clutch. Everything came down to your right wrist, your clutch hand, and your nerve. Owners talked about the connection, the way the engine's pulse seemed to synchronize with the rider, how every input translated instantly into motion. It was and remains a motorcycle that demands respect. When the RC30 finally reached showrooms in 1987, It was less a product launch and more a quiet revolution. Only about 3,000 units were produced globally, each one assembled by hand. For the average rider, it was out of reach, both financially and in terms of skill. But that wasn't the point. The RC30 existed to homologate Honda's racing weapon for the street, and in doing so, it blurred the line between competition and commerce. This was Honda's way of telling the world, we don't just build motorcycles, we build dominance. And yet, beneath that bravado, there was a certain poetry to it, a belief that perfection, if executed correctly, could be experienced by anyone willing to chase it. The RC30 wasn't just a machine, it was a statement of what engineering could achieve when the accountants were told to wait outside. But even at that level, Honda knew it had to prove that all this effort was worth it. The real question was whether this meticulously crafted street racer could actually deliver on its promise, whether the blend of V4 sophistication and hand-built precision would dominate where it mattered most, the racetrack. That's where the RC30's legend would be tested next. When the Honda RC30 hit the racing world, it was immediately clear that this wasn't a mere homologation exercise. It was a precision instrument, sharpened to take advantage of every rule in the New World Superbike Championship. The RC30 wasn't just the street-legal version of a racer, it was the racer, lightly disguised for civilian duty. The 748cc V4 engine that defined the Honda RC30 quickly proved itself in competition, combining the smooth torque delivery of a road bike with the screaming top end of a GP machine. Riders found it deceptively manageable, a motorcycle that didn't overwhelm you with brute force but rewarded finesse. That balance, accessible yet lethal, made it a favorite among privateer teams who could finally compete on nearly equal footing with factory squads. Honda's gamble paid off almost immediately. In 1988, the RC30 dominated the inaugural World Superbike season, taking Fred Merkel to the championship title. It wasn't just a victory for a rider, it was validation of an entire philosophy. Honda's engineers had built something that worked flawlessly both in theory and in the chaos of real racing. Merkel's bike was nearly stock by racing standards, proof that the production RC30 truly was a race machine in street clothes. The bike's cornering stability, mid-range drive, and surgical throttle response gave it a kind of consistency no rival could match. Even in endurance racing, where durability mattered as much as outright speed, the RC30 proved indestructible, racking up wins at Suzuka, the Isle of Man TT, and countless national championships. What made the RC30's dominance even more remarkable was how quietly it achieved it. While other manufacturers shouted about horsepower figures and top speeds, Honda focused on refinement. The RC30's gear-driven camshafts didn't just sound exotic, they ensured timing precision that translated into linear power delivery and bulletproof reliability. The engine could spin to over 12,000 RPM without protest, yet it would idle smoothly in traffic. In the pits, mechanics praised its accessibility and thoughtful layout. This was a machine designed by people who raced, not marketers, yet that obsession came with a cost. The RC30's meticulous craftsmanship made it brutally expensive to produce. Every component was specialized, every assembly step slower than mass production would tolerate. Honda didn't make money on the RC30. It made a point. For the company, this was a halo project meant to demonstrate supremacy. To buyers, it became a symbol of mechanical purity. In the US, only a limited number were imported, making it as elusive as it was desirable. Enthusiasts who managed to acquire one described it as equal parts sculpture and scalpel. As the racing seasons rolled on, the RC30's influence spread. Other manufacturers were forced to respond, creating their own homologation specials, machines that brought advanced materials, lightweight construction, and race-bred technology to the street. But even as the competition intensified, few matched Honda's blend of polish and purpose. Where others chased outright speed, the RC30 prioritized balance. Its chassis geometry, mass distribution, and suspension tuning were so well integrated that riders often described it as telepathic. It became a benchmark not just for lap times, but for how a motorcycle should feel. By the early 90s, the landscape had begun to shift. Regulations tightened, costs soared, and the idea of building a hand-finished race replica for the street became increasingly difficult to justify. Honda moved on to the RC45, a successor that refined rather than reinvented, but the mystique of the RC30 never faded. Collectors began hoarding them, racers retired them to display, and journalists continued to call it one of the finest motorcycles ever. Built what the RC30 represented went beyond performance. It represented the last gasp of a philosophy where engineering purity trumped profit. It was the embodiment of Honda's total control ethos, years before that phrase became marketing copy. Every element of its design, every weld, every fastener, every machined surface was there because it needed to be. The RC30 didn't just win races. It set a new expectation for what a production motorcycle could be. But that success created a dilemma. How do you follow perfection? The RC30 raised the bar so high that even Honda struggled to eclipse it. As newer technologies emerged, fuel injection, traction control, lightweight composites, the RC30's analog nature became both its charm and its limitation. In a world moving toward digital sophistication, it stood as a monument to mechanical mastery. Yet its legacy persisted, shaping not only Honda's future V4s but the entire concept of the Homologation special. The RC30's victory was no longer about championships. It was about influence, and that influence continues to echo through every modern superbike that claims to bridge the gap between track and street. The next chapter of the story asks a bigger question. What does the RC30 mean today, in an era when speed is easy but soul is rare? The Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaiso may have been outlawed, but its spirit never died. In fact, what came after the raids was arguably more powerful than the car itself, a movement built on nostalgia, resilience, and the unrelenting will of enthusiasts to keep a dream alive. Once the seizures made headlines, the story of the Kaiso R34 transcended the car scene. It became a parable about ingenuity versus authority, a reminder that innovation often blooms in the margins. What started as a technical workaround evolved into cultural rebellion. The car that broke the rules ended up rewriting them. When people talk about the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaiso today, they're not just recalling a single vehicle, they're recalling a shift in the entire landscape of automotive passion. For years, the R34 was a digital legend. It lived in video games, movies, and posters, but few had seen one in person. The Kaiso era changed that. It gave physical form to fantasy. For a brief window in the mid-2000s, Americans could stand next to a living, breathing Skyline, even if it wasn't supposed to be here. That fleeting access left a permanent mark. To the generation that grew up watching Too Fast, Too Furious, the Kaiso R34 wasn't just a car, it was the physical embodiment of the impossible becoming real. After the dust settled, the legal landscape began to shift. The crackdown on Kaiso cars had exposed how outdated US import regulations were, particularly the infamous 25-year rule. Enthusiasts argued that cars like the R34 represented cultural heritage, not just horsepower. Lawmakers listened, slowly. In the following decade, small reforms and exemptions began to appear. The show or display rule gave collectors limited options to legally own cars that were once off-limits, as long as they weren't driven excessively. And as the years passed, the R34 inched closer to the magic 25-year mark, meaning full legal importation would soon be possible. Ironically, the very controversy that destroyed Kaiso's business also helped pave the way for the Skyline's eventual legalization. Meanwhile, the Kaiso R34's image continued to evolve. It became a touchstone for conversations about authenticity and car culture. Was a Kaiso Skyline real if it had a new VIN and was technically a kit car? Purists debated endlessly, but enthusiasts knew the truth. It didn't matter. The experience behind the wheel, the turbo spool, the AWD grip, the RB26 scream, was identical. Kaiso cars might have lived in legal limbo, but their emotional impact was 100% genuine. For owners, driving one wasn't about defying the government. It was about connecting to something transcendent, something mechanical yet deeply human. Over time, the surviving Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 Kaiso builds became prized artifacts. Some were quietly reassembled overseas. Others resurfaced in private American collections, carefully maintained but rarely shown. A few slipped into museums under display-only status, their plates removed, their stories whispered by curators who knew their significance. These cars now exist in a strange space, half legend, half evidence. They represent a chapter of automotive history where passion outpaced permission, and innovation tiptoed around regulation. Beyond the car community, the Kaiso story continues to resonate because it mirrors the spirit of every enthusiast who's ever wanted something the system said they couldn't have. It's about curiosity, risk, and creativity. the same forces that push engineers to design better machines and fans to chase perfection. And in an era where cars are increasingly digital, automated, and sanitized, the raw defiance of the Kaiso R34 feels more important than ever. It reminds us of a time when people built, tuned, and fought for their dreams, one bolt at a time. Today, the Nissan Skyline GTR R34 Kaiso stands as both cautionary tale and cultural monument. It warns against cutting corners, but also celebrates those bold enough to think differently. Its DNA can be found in every import shop that fights to keep old engines alive, in every petition for fairer automotive laws, in every enthusiast who refuses to settle for close enough. Even now, as fully legal R34s trickle into the US under the 25-year rule, their arrival feels like the closing of a long, cinematic loop, the story that began with Kaiso finally finding redemption. The outlaw became the icon. The loophole became the legacy. And in the end, the Nissan Skyline GTR R34, Kaiso proved that passion isn't just what drives a car, it's what drives a culture. But there's still one more chapter to this saga, the part that affects anyone thinking about buying, owning or preserving an R34 today, and what lessons the Kaiso story offers for the future of car culture in America. For American enthusiasts, the Honda RC30 remains both an icon and a ghost, known by reputation, rarely seen in the wild. With only a few hundred officially imported, most examples ended up in private collections or track-only builds, leaving few in public hands. Today, finding a genuine US spec RC30 in original condition is almost mythical. The few that appear on auction sites often fetch six figures, and that number keeps climbing. Collectors aren't just paying for rarity, they're paying for proof that once, a major manufacturer built something with the soul of a prototype and the manners of a masterpiece. The Honda RC30's legacy in the US runs deeper than its numbers suggest. For the riders lucky enough to experience one, it redefined what a superbike could feel like. The 748cc V4 delivered around 110 horsepower, modest by modern standards, but it felt alive in a way few bikes ever have. Throttle response was immediate, corner exits effortless, and the chassis communicated every ounce of grip. Even at low speeds, you could sense its precision, like a scalpel waiting for the right hand. Many owners describe it as meditative, the way the gear-driven cams sing, the subtle vibrations through the clip-ons, the mechanical hum that feels both refined and raw. Ownership, however, is not for the faint of heart. The RC30 demands attention, patience, and money. Replacement parts are scarce, and proper maintenance requires specialists familiar with its quirks. Its titanium rods and close-tolerance internals mean oil changes are non-negotiable. Many examples spend more time in climate-controlled garages than on open roads. But that's part of the RC30's appeal. It isn't just transportation, it's a commitment. For those who take care of it, it rewards with an experience modern superbikes can't replicate. Pure mechanical dialogue, undiluted by electronics. From a collector's perspective, the RC30 has entered blue-chip territory. Prices for pristine units have surpassed even its successor, the RC45, and continue to trend upward. Provenance matters. Original paint, matching numbers, and factory documentation can double its value. But even heavily used examples, if maintained properly, are treasured. They aren't relics. They're artifacts of a philosophy that's nearly extinct. That's why you'll find RC30s in museums and private collections side by side, with race-winning prototypes. They all share the same DNA: reliability. Despite the RC30's racing pedigree, remains surprisingly solid. When serviced correctly, the V4 can last tens of thousands of miles without issue. Honda's engineering foresight meant every component was overbuilt. The same precision that made it competitive also made it dependable. Still, this is not a bike to be neglected. Skip a service and the costs multiply fast. But to enthusiasts, that's part of the deal. You're maintaining a piece of racing heritage, not a commuter. Culturally, the RC30's shadow still hangs over Honda's performance identity. Every time Honda unveils a new V4, comparisons are inevitable. The company's MotoGP RC213V, the modern RC213VS street bike, and even the VFR 800F all owe something to that original blueprint. The RC30 wasn't just a machine, it was a manifesto that Honda still follows today. Racing technology built with integrity, for riders who understand the difference. So what does all this mean for the American viewer, the one who might never own or even see an RC30 in person? It means the legend still has something to teach. The RC30 is a reminder that craftsmanship and intent matter, that sometimes the most meaningful performance isn't about the fastest lap, but about how a machine makes you feel when everything works in harmony. For those hunting the dream, expect to pay at least $60,000 for a usable example, and upwards of $150,000 for a collector-grade bike. Parts are scarce, but communities exist. Small, passionate groups who trade knowledge and support like caretakers of a living species. Insurance is specialized, maintenance costly, but the reward is unmatched. Ride it sparingly, keep it clean, and you're not just an owner, you're a curator of history. In the end, the Honda RC30 stands for something few machines ever achieve: authenticity. Built by engineers who believed in doing things the hard way because it was the right way. It's not just a motorcycle, it's a milestone in human ingenuity, proof that perfection is possible when passion leads the project. And as long as riders still dream of that gear-driven whine and that perfect balance of form and function, the RC30 will never fade. It will live on in garages, in memories, and in the way we define what greatness really means.